everyone. Welcome to Key Takeaways. I'm Chuck Murphy, and I'm joined with Maggie Bright, as usual. And today we are going to talk about picking the right moderator for your qualitative project, which sounds like a really simple topic, but is something we end up debating quite a bit on different projects. And so I thought it'd be interesting to talk about some of the considerations we have. Some of them are obvious, and some of them you may not have thought about. So we thought this would be a good thing to spend some time having coffee with. Good morning, Maggie.
Good morning. How are you today?
I'm excellent.
Looks like it's nice and sunny where you are. I am on the opposite coast and it's not so sunny.
The DC's not known for its weather.
the DC coast is a little gray today. The coast.
It's funny. This is our first podcast in a long time. We took a bit of an extended break, you know.
Yeah. There's a lot going on. It's been a busy couple months.
First down, you get a free pass on the podcast. You gotta buy a new microphone. You gotta buy all this stuff. You know,
right?
Takes a little while to kind of get going again. So
that's why we're doing the podcast, right? Because you finally got your microphone, so we're back in business.
You know, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to dive back in and love to talk about qualitative research. I feel like if you start in psychology, qualitative is kind of feels like your first grade, your natural home.
Yes, I love it. I love it. And I really think that qualitative has come back in a very in-person qualitative in a very major way post-pandemic. It took a few years, but we, I feel like we do as much qualitative now as quantitative. So making sure we have the right moderator is key to the process.
I know. And it's funny. It is something that sounds really simple, right? And sometimes it's like everyone agrees like, oh yeah, this is perfect for so-and-so. But sometimes it's a little tricky. And we were talking about this the other day for something and we ended up talking about it for like a half hour, like pros and cons of different approaches. And so I thought it would be good to outline a few like rules or questions that we sort of ask each other at the beginning of these projects.
I love it. I also think a lot of people, not a lot of people, but I don't know that everyone understands how challenging it is to moderate also. So it's not like you can just put anyone in that position. It has to really be not only a great moderator, but then the right fit with the various aspects of the project too. So I think this is a fabulous exercise and one that we go through often, like you said.
Yeah. There's an old saying in sports that when an announcer is doing a really good job, you never think about him. And when they're not doing a good job, you think about them all. You can't help but notice them.
It's true.
Right? Like if they're good at it, you kind of don't even think about it too much.
Yeah.
And then, but if something goes wrong or if, where in my experience, where this gets most difficult, is if a client doesn't like a moderator. You know what I mean?
Yeah, because you're really sitting there. I mean, it's a very captive audience when you're watching qualitative. So if you will notice that people pick up on the slightest little things. I mean, if they don't like, how much someone gesticulates or the tone of their voice or their inflection and those types of things, like I actually had an email the other day from a client that was kind of like, I don't like the lighting. This is going all wrong. Why is this moderator talking so fast? And it really derails the project if it's not the right fit. And like I said, in a lot of different aspects.
Yeah, it's funny. I've also had projects where it's like, why is this moderator talking so slow? You know what I mean? So it does. It's
the same moderator. The one talking fast and the one talking slow was the same moderator. So you never know.
It is funny. So I scribbled down a few notes as I was thinking about this last night. And so you feel free to interject, but I came up with 7 little categories of things we ask about.
I like it.
The first thing I thought of is probably the most basic, but obviously we got to talk about it. Is there any specialized knowledge that's required for this? Like the first thing I thought about is gaming, right? Because some of these, some of these gaming projects, like there's just no way for a moderator to come up to speed on the depth of some of these things if you're not in that world. But medical stuff is like that.
I totally agree. I think, it's sort of, is it a B2B or a B2C? Because I do think there's also a unique kind of B2B expertise that people need to have. And then, the sort of the more nuanced the topic is, the more nuanced the moderator's knowledge needs to be. Gaming's a great example. Medical expertise is a good one. I also think it's helpful if the moderator has engaged in the category, even if we're talking about food. I mean, if we're doing bacon research and the moderator is a vegetarian, that might not be the perfect fit. Now, I think most people can have enough experience with food categories that they can talk about it. But it's important to ask a lot of questions about what the moderator knows and what they've done before, because the client obviously knows their category really well and can pick up on the fact if the moderator isn't knowledgeable about what they're asking.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny because it's even I even worried about bringing it up first. I mean, I feel like you have to bring it up first because it's the most obvious thing. But I also think, although it is very important, and there are certain times. I mean, the B2B stuff is true too. The medical stuff is true. I also think it's one of the areas that is most misunderstood by people. I think um, many people in research way overweight this one. You know, a good moderator it can mostly do anything, right? I think there are exceptions, and we just mentioned a few of them, right? But I think sometimes you'll see. I mean, we obviously can't name names here, but there's certain let's call them circles, right? that like to go back to the same people all the time, and they're sort of insiders, right? You see this in politics all the time too. You
Mm-hmm.
have this insider that's like, this is our person that we go to all the time, and they don't get enough outside perspective, and they don't give enough new people a chance because one of the things that is we know this in qualitative research is the moderators, certainly the most important piece of a qualitative research project in most methods. um, they could change the content a little bit, like, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, but so if you always are putting the same person out there, I think it could be bad, and you see that in certain industries where it's just like, nope, these are the three we use, and it's like, okay, well, should try
Yeah.
some new people because it's much easier than I think a lot of like less experienced researchers realize to come into a new category and quickly figure it out if you're a good listener, right? Because that's, if you're doing 60 or 90 IDIs or whatever, it should only take you a couple to start figuring out what's moving the needle for people, and even if you're coming in cold.
You to sort of flip this on its head too, you could make the argument that in some cases an unbiased moderator is a great thing to have, right? I mean, they should be unbiased in sort of the way they ask, but one who's less familiar about the category, if you're really going into sort of like, hey, have the consumers like, tell me about this, explain it to me, because I don't really understand it. There is some value in that sort
Yep,
of approach as
absolutely,
well,
right?
depending
Because
on what the
they'll ask the
topic is.
basic questions, right? They won't just
Yes.
assume. They'll ask the basic questions sometimes that people who've been in it for a while skip over.
Yep.
And sometimes that's where you need to be, right? It's like, wait a minute, why is that? Why do we think
Yeah.
that?
Yeah,
Uh,
no, I think so I think it's not always that you're looking for the person who's the most experienced in that category, but you're looking for the person who's the best fit for the topic that you're covering, and that could mean a lot of different things. That's why the conversations last a long time sometimes.
exactly. Well, and it's funny. Well, we'll talk about that a bit more later. But we actually, that was a nice segue into the second thing I wrote down, which is language and cultural considerations, because
Yep.
it's got a similar dynamic, I think, where it's like, in some ways, it's like, duh, obviously, if the groups are in Spanish, you do Spanish speaking moderator. But it also can get real tricky real fast, right? Because again, it can, depending on, the age or ethnicity or whatever of the moderator, it actually can change what people will say to them, right?
Mhm.
And
But I
it's
think that's the critical point, though, is that you want a moderator who makes the participants feel comfortable sharing their views very openly and honestly. And that can mean a lot of different things depending on who the respondents are and what the topic is, right? If we're talking to teenagers, that's something different than if we're talking to 50-year-old females. If we're talking about cereal versus we're talking about your medical history, right? Those are very different things. And so it's like, what's the person who's going to make this group of people feel the most comfortable being honest and authentic about how they feel, and about their opinions on something. And that means different things to different people. I mean, there's, like you said, there's obvious one. If we're doing the groups in Spanish, we obviously need someone who speaks Spanish. So that's a key piece. But there actually aren't as many Hispanic moderators as you would think, right? So that actually narrows the field quite a bit in terms of when you're selecting the right person for the group. So I think there's a lot of really delicate conversations, and half the time, we'll recruit groups in Spanish, and we might end up, the groups might be done in both English and Spanish, depending on what the participants are most comfortable speaking in. So you kind of never know. You need someone who is able to adapt. And I think that's one of the things that we're going to talk about later on as well, is like how adaptable is the person if the environment changes.
Yeah. Yeah, and it comes up with age and ethnicity a lot too. Like if you're doing team groups, is it better to have a younger person who's maybe got less experience doing something like this, or to have someone that's like more experienced? But obviously, like, there's an age gap between them and the respondents. It comes up with like pregnant women. Like there's a lot of different cases where you're like, oh, should I try to match the culture a little bit more here, or should we just bring in someone? So it's a very interesting debate to have.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think there's no one right answer to that, right? It's more of sort of like you're balancing off all the different elements to where you feel most comfortable and where the client feels most comfortable in the end.
it's a very inside baseball thing, but on big qual projects when there's multiple moderators, I always love seeing how the tone or the answers change a little bit depending on how consumers are reading the moderators. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Um,
I think that also, I mean, while this is a little bit tangential, it also is very imperative that you set your group configurations up correctly so that the moderator doesn't also have to bridge different, making the moderator's job easier by at least having a group that is cohesive and can talk and isn't turned off by each other, so that the moderator doesn't also have to sort of bridge that barrier as well. So, like, you know, help your moderator out by composing the groups correctly.
Make it easy on me, please.
Right? Exactly.
It just occurred to me that we could probably do a whole half-hour podcast on like moderator horror stories. I don't know.
Right? You know what's so funny? I was actually thinking about that. I'm like, do I get to ask Chuck a moderator horror story at the end of this?
It's probably not good it's probably not good for the category, right? We don't want everybody to listen to this thick and naked. Most of the time,
No,
my
that's
worst
true.
experiences were years and years ago.
I was thinking more about something that happened to you while you were moderating that was a challenge versus throwing any of our amazing moderators under the bus.
I like that. I like.
Yeah.
I mean, that would be a hilarious blog post to try to think about it. It reminds me of when we used to have the open end Hall of Fame. We were just
Yes.
things people wrote.
Yes.
That would make for a good blog post. I haven't thought about that in a while, but
Yes.
all right. So let's get into some of the more like nuanced things, right? So we talked a little bit about culture. We talked about specialized knowledge. The third thing I wrote down. By the way, feel free to just say that, come up with something that's not in my list that I.
No, your list is fantastic. I have nothing to add or subtract.
um, but when you start getting into style considerations, I think this is really interesting. And I think it's something that I don't know. I don't think a lot of people in research think about it too much, unless you're kind of on our side of the table. But there is a lot of kind of style may not be the right word, but there's a lot of considerations in terms of like there, sometimes there's these projects get so big, right? Because you have like the brand side researchers, you might have agencies involved, and then you have people from our side. Um, so finding the right fit, I came up with three on just a quick, consensus building versus challenging, which I think um, could be a big thing for people. Some people, if you're a traditional like, you know, social sciences researcher, the moderator should be listening, right, and kind of a more passive voice. But if you're a person from an ad agency trying to kind of really throw a lot of ideas at people quickly, you want a moderator with an active voice that could sell an idea and see how people react to it. Um, and those are kind of different skill sets, right? Like, um,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, and it can
I
be
think
tricky to think about. Sometimes, we'll be like, well, this. So, anyhow, that's a big one. Like how kind of traditional researcher they are versus, um,
yeah. And I think that's super dependent on the type of project you're doing too, what you're looking for there, right? If we're doing some what would be more traditional concept testing, you obviously want someone who's going to sit back and listen and see how people are, reacting to the stimuli you've put in front of them. To me, that's more kind of by the book. But if you're doing something that's like really exploratory, getting into the creative space, and you have to like pull ideas out of people, in a lot of ways, you want someone who's going to be a little bit more I'll say creative in their approach and sort of willing to really challenge people to to like dig deeper and think harder about what they're saying. So a lot of times the same moderator has both of those skill sets, and what you have to do is ask them to bring the right tools to that particular project. So it could be that the moderator that you're using just needs some guidance on which one of those techniques to really lean into, because they're capable of doing both.
It's interesting you said it's funny because I think this could be a point we could debate, but I would tend to say people are who they are, and
Oh,
they're not as comfortable. Like, for example, like, this comes up in therapy a lot, right? I am naturally like, I have a big personality, obviously, and I have a loud voice.
no.
So it's hard for me to be too passive for too long, right? And these call
Yeah.
projects, you're traveling together, you're going to different cities. You kind of like, you are who you are at some point. And the people
Yeah.
that are more challenging in the room, I think, tend to be better in the back room. And the people
Hmm.
who are more researchy in the room tend to be a little quieter in the back room because they do the same thing in the back room, right? And
Yeah.
there are pros and cons to that, right?
I think I would agree with you that most people probably have a dominant or like a preferred style, but I think that some people can be malleable and adjust to
Yeah.
what the topic is. Maybe not long term. I think everyone sort of has a default approach to this. I mean, I know that one of my challenges in moderating is that I will call people out when I feel like they're contradicting themselves, and that may not be the right approach always.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm better in the back room for projects that require more of the listening versus the challenge. I'm more of the challenging type. But I do think that I've seen great moderators adapt, to those
Well,
styles when needed.
I think that's the other thing that's important to point out is we're coming at this a little bit in a bubble, right? Like we work on really big projects with really big budgets, and so we tend to be working with kind of unicorns in the moderator space too.
Mm-hmm.
They people that can very
True.
quickly like fit both worlds. But when you think about like watching younger people learn to moderate and earlier on their careers and the people at the lower end of the budget spectrum, um, they're not quite there yet.
That's a fair point. Yeah.
We kind of, you know, um, but there is an interesting whole therapy story to this side too about how that like. But anyhow, I'm going to skip that. The other
You
thing,
can't say there's an interesting story and then say you're going to skip it. I'll let it slide this time, but next time you're going to
I
have to home.
don't want to go too long. We tend to always go long on these. But the other thing that is, this is a little bit of a third rail topic, but I think it's a very important topic for people that are on our side of the business, which is this kind of like, I put it in my list as discipline versus adaptive. But the reality is that, I think a lot of brand side researchers or client side researchers don't understand as much about the demands on the moderator, or they don't think about it as much as we do. And there are some clients that, are very organized and have their ducks in a row real early, and that makes the moderator's job easier. And there are some clients that are very they have a lot of ideas, and they have a lot of ideas as the thing is going. And that's not a bad thing, but it could be a real challenge for certain moderators because if the guide is changing every group and we're moving sections in and out, it requires a lot of um, improv is the wrong word, but just requires a lot of adaptation by the
Yeah.
moderator. And
I think too there's a skill in knowing when to and I think a lot of times this falls on sort of our shoulders in knowing when to push back on that desire to be adapt the guide versus to stay disciplined with the guide, right? If we're doing like concept testing, if we're testing a bunch of concepts and we change the guide and the concepts every single group, that's a real challenge when we get to the report piece, right? Because we don't know what's a result because we've changed things versus what's a result because that's the actual consumer sentiment. And so I think that moderators also in tandem with who's in the controlling things in the back room have to be really mindful about, is it good for the project to be disciplined versus is it good for the project to be more adaptable in this situation? And I think that moderators have different skills in sort of doing that piece of the puzzle. Some moderators are great at really understanding how their changes affect the overall outcome of the project, while some are more focused on, hey, this is what the client asked for and the goal is to please the client. And I think both of those approaches can be the right approach in some situations, but not in all situations. And so it's important to understand which moderators are great at feeling that piece of the puzzle out and which really need you to guide them through, hey, don't touch this. This has to stay the same every single time. So I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle is kind of, once the moderator is in the focus group room, it is really hard for the back room to control things. And so you have to have a lot of trust
Yeah.
about, that person sees the same vision that you see when you set up the discussion guide or when you talked about the
Yeah,
objectives.
it also that also puts a load on the analyst too. Like, I could tell you so many times being in presentations where someone will be like, "Hey, what did that person say to that question?" It's like, "Oh, that person didn't that question. That question was there." It's like, and you're
Yeah.
just like, it creates confusion later on of like, "Wait a minute, why did?" So that can be hard. And but it also, um, I also see why people that are really involved, like, you do have questions that come up and you want to explore them. And my favorite version of this was it was a client who had an earpiece that the moderator had to wear, so the client could talk to the moderator during the group. And which is, if you think about it, like, that's tough.
That's
That's hard.
that is really tough. I've had ones who like to text the moderator
Yeah,
during the groups, and I'm like, ooh, I would not like that.
yeah.
um,
Uh,
so
it could be challenging. Okay, so the fourth thing I had on my list was how much creativity is needed for the objectives, and I think this is an important one, especially if there's agencies involved.
yep.
And it's funny because there's certain people who are really really good at this, um, and really good at working with agencies, and they understand the way creative people think. Uh,
Hmm.
and I think that's almost like a different skill set, right? Like, it's a different niche.
I think so. Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that in some ways goes back to your discipline versus adaptability, right? Like how much a lot of times when we have these more creative projects, we'll write a guide that has sort of option A, B, C, D that you choose your own adventure based on how the groups are going, and that's a really unique skill set to have to be able to pivot mid group if something's not working and go in a different direction with a different exercise, and to be prepared to do that without really knowing how the group's going to go is, I think, a really hard skill set to find. And so finding someone who has that um, is great, but it's not necessary for every group, right? Like, you're totally right. Like, you don't need to have different routes depending on how the discussion goes for every group. So I agree with you that um, some moderators are great at that, some aren't, and some projects don't require it, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah, some
But kind
people
of
just.
understanding where your groups are going to go is really important as you think through that piece of it.
I remember years ago when I was first starting out, or when I was much younger than I am now. There was this woman we used to work with, and she would have like 27 bracelets on each arm. She looked like Madonna. She had her hair was flying out, but she just loved to brainstorm. Like, she loved to talk about like little pieces of concepts or communication pieces, and just. But she had all these ideas. You know what I mean? Like, half the ideas would come from her. Which the agency people loved. Like, oh, that's a great way to put it. Like, you know what I mean? She just would
Yeah,
constantly, she would spend the whole 2 hours just kind of, she loved to kind of get feedback on concepts and talk about different little changes and wordings and colors and, whatever. And some people truly love that, and it comes out really quickly. And those people are fantastic.
yeah.
Talking
Not
about.
always great with time management in the groups, but fantastic when you need to ideate and come up with
Exactly.
ideas.
Exactly. Yeah. They're not, yeah, they're definitely not going to do. Yeah. And so the other thing I had on my list is how much does the moderator style match up with the client style? And this is like a little bit different, I think, than the projects needs that we were talking about earlier, but the
Yeah,
same kind of idea of like, um, some, clients have a very particular type of research typically. Like, the two ideas I had on this were like, the deep and emotional kind of style, like someone like really likes to be very, Freudian, versus like a more like consulty, decisive, pragmatic. I want a job at McKinsey type thing.
yeah.
Uh,
I think too that the how the moderator functions in the back room is an important piece of this too. There's some clients that really love the moderator to come back and sort of discuss in deep detail what happened in the group, or to sort of pontificate about a particular participant in terms of how they reacted to something. And some moderators are really great at that, and some clients really enjoy it. And other clients really, see the moderator as more of like, you have a specific function and task, and it's in the, sort of the front of the house, and the back of the house really isn't part of the job description, and finding moderators who fit those pieces of the puzzle too are really important, because some moderators don't really want to be in the back and others love to be in the back. And I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. And I think that's also a consideration for who the project team is too. Like sometimes we need a moderator who's really vocal in all parts of the project, and sometimes we don't. And so that's not only is it a fit with the client, but also a fit with the project and the project team that's working on the each one of these objectives as well.
Yeah, yeah. It is. There's so much interpersonal time on these qual projects. You know what I mean? You really get to know who you're traveling.
Which is fantastic in a lot of ways, right? I feel like that's it, and you learn the business better, and you learn all sorts of amazing things because you do spend so much time together, which further highlights this point that like it has to be the right fit from a personality perspective, because you're often traveling together. You may be spending a full week together in a small space that is often dark. So everyone better like each other.
Yeah, it's important.
It really is.
We touched on this earlier, but another thing that comes up here is kind of like, insider outsider. Like, is this a person that there are certain categories that just have this, like, this person's an insider in our industry. Like in automotive, entertainment, like there's just like certain categories where they just go, there's like, and they're very mistrusting of kind of outsiders.
Yeah.
And there's other categories where people don't care and they like to try new people. And
Yeah. I mean, I think in a lot of categories where there's a very specific nomenclature to how things are talked about, and like a lot of times that's like medical or automotive, like the client will want the moderator to understand that nomenclature, all the acronyms, or whatever it is that goes along with that category. And if they don't, that's a dead giveaway that they're not familiar with the category or haven't worked in that category before. And I will say, and this is certainly not in any way a negative, but if you look at most moderators' bios or their sort of when they send out, like, here's what I've done, most of them will list pretty much every category that you can think of as part of their bio, which is, again, most of them have probably touched on some of those categories at some point in their career in some way. And so it's not like they're lying or anything like that. But I do think that it is sort of imperative that you probe a little deeper around, like, okay, well, how much experience do you really have in this category? What type of work was that? And find out if that level of expertise matches sort of where your client is or where they want to go. Because I do think, most of the moderators that we're working with do work across a lot of different categories fairly regularly. So it's not enough. It's not that they've never touched some of these categories, but it's their depth within those and making sure the depth fits.
Yeah, it's a funny dynamic, right? Because it's true. It's also true of like vendors, right? Like everyone has a list of like, oh, here's like the 75 different companies I've worked for, but you'll also, like, there's like kind of who's insiders in certain industries and who's more outsiders, and it's just kind of the way people get positioned through relationships and stuff. It's very common.
Yeah.
But it can be an interesting. Actually, that segues nicely into our next little bullet point, which is the practical things like budget availability, right? Which sometimes is in the background for all these things, right? Hey, the person you're most comfortable with isn't available for 5 weeks, or is twice as expensive, or whatever, and you have to kind of weigh these. Maybe this is the time to try someone new, like or do you want to wait 6 weeks for your person that you're comfortable with?
I think too, there's often, moderators who are in high demand are often, particularly in a world where we can do a lot of things virtually now, are doing multiple projects simultaneously. And like, are you okay with that? Are you okay with sort of like a slightly wonky schedule so that you can get your work done in the time frame that you need? Are you okay with the fact that the moderator is going to be balancing different topics and will have to switch back and forth and may have their attention sort of divided at times? And so I think even if the person might be available, thinking about sort of their mental bandwidth is part of this equation too. And like, where will they be physically located while they're doing the virtual IDIs? Are they going to be in the same country that you're in? Are they going to be in the same time zones? Like, is their internet connection going to be good if they're somewhere else? Like, all of that, like, really does. It seems really like silly to think about, but it makes a difference, because if someone loses their internet connection mid group, like, that's a big problem.
Yeah, the virtual thing has added all these different scheduling considerations, right?
Yeah.
Like before it was just like, can you get to Atlanta by this date? Now it's like, oh wait, you can do it, but how are you doing it?
Yeah.
You're getting up at 3 a.m. Like, yeah. So it's a little. You're right. That is. It's funny how often the practical things. Um,
Yeah. I mean, it's a whole different set of questions that, I think we weren't asking all those questions 10 years ago, like,
I
because
know.
they didn't matter. But it is a crazy, it is there. In some ways it's great to have the virtual call because you can get a lot more done. And that, some of the sort of practical travel logistics are removed, but it adds all these other factors into the mix.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. All right, the last thing on my list.
We made it to the end of the list.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive, huh? And actually reasonably on time. We're at like 32
I
minutes
know.
right now. That's pretty good. And
It's pretty good
then
for
the
us.
last thing, we've already touched on this, but kind of more softer questions about like, does this person fit the client's expectations and comfort? And it's funny. Like you were talking earlier about Hispanic moderators, and I do think we've always joked about this, but there's kind of a lot of Hispanic moderators that don't look Hispanic, which always creates like a funny dynamic in the room when they walk in and people assume that they're not, and then they start talking in Spanish. People are like, "Oh, you like." So like that there are people do have expectations, and it's funny to sometimes you just need to talk about those with the client. Like, are you okay
Yeah.
with that? Or you definitely get some people are very focused on things like degrees, or experience or backgrounds. So all of those
That's,
things kind of come up in this
I,
process.
the one I think about a lot is if we're doing any groups with kids or younger consumers, and like, is that person like,
A
you
parent.
know, have they been a parent before? Have they worked with young? It's really hard to get six year olds to focus on what you're talking about for 90 minutes. Like, how are they at actually managing a room? I think is really important. And have you thought through those types of things, or are
Yeah,
they parents who can empathize with like sort of the chaos that's going on? Um, and I think that's important. I always we do a lot of work in like fitness and those types of things, and it's like, do we need is the moderator fit like in
yeah,
shape, like can they do they have credibility talking about some of these things that we're asking about, and that doesn't mean it has to be like an Iron Man or something like that, but is there sort of like this, like, do they make sense with the topic?
yeah. Yeah, and it is important because like in so many of these different topical areas, consumers will say these one-off, or not even, they'll mention things like you mentioned acronyms earlier, but even just like references that if you're not deep in it, you might not understand. The parent thing is a good one too, yeah, because it's like if you haven't had kids, it sometimes is hard to understand what parents mean.
Hmm.
That's true in so many different areas,
Yeah. I think
but
it doesn't mean that it's not a deal breaker, right? But it's just something to consider, something to think about as part of the, all the different pros and cons that you're weighing.
yeah, and like I said earlier, at the top end of this, I think it's something that people mostly overweight. Right, a
Yeah.
good researcher, a good moderator, is actually like. I think people don't understand sometimes that there is. I mean, I always use therapy references because where I started, but there's a process to therapy that if you understand the process, it doesn't really work the way people think it works, right?
Right.
And I think I've told you this story before, but talk about. Have I ever told you that? So I'm old. So when I was in grad school, um, AIDS was raging, and I took a job at an AIDS response program. Have I told you this story before?
No, I don't think so.
So I took a job at this AIDS response program, which is run through you know, the this was in San Diego, the San Diego LGBTQ Center or whatever, and they had this funding to, basically help people who were infected with AIDS, and everyone assumed that I was gay because I was working at the center, right? And what I was focused on was more like, oh, you've got this terminal disease, right? But it was an interesting thing, like because you had to kind of like it was an important thing to just mention, hey, just so you know, I'm straight, but that would really throw some people. They would just be like,
Huh.
you can't do this if you're straight, and it's like actually like I totally can, but
Right.
if you're not comfortable with that, right? So it's
Yeah.
like but it's an interesting thing and I feel like that happens in moderation. People are just like, oh, you can't moderate a kids group if you have it with parents. Actually, you can. You can do a great job
Yeah.
if you're a moderator. And usually the best moderators, I think, just disclose it up front. They have a quick conversation with people. Say, hey, just so you
Yeah.
know, like, I don't have kids, so some of the things you say, I might ask follow-up questions. And they're actually really good at setting that up, I think, a lot of times like that. And it actually does give people the freedom to then explain it in more detail rather
Yeah.
than the moderator just knows and they nod along, right? So
I totally agree. I feel like it can be used as an advantage
yeah,
to
it totally
sort of
can.
dig deeper.
And it's funny because like sometimes we'll have this conversation, about incredibly specific little categories. People will be like, oh, they've never worked with, my, organic, you know, whatever baseball cleats. And you're like, listen,
Baseball cleats. I love it.
they know how to ask about this. So it's like, but
Yeah.
people mostly overweight the experience thing or the
Yeah.
personal experience, and they underweight the kind of research expertise.
Well, I also think too, like one of my things that I always look for is I want someone who's curious about the category, because then I think that a moderator will come into the discussion and sort of be like, oh, tell me more, explain more. If they actually are interested in, whatever the category is we're talking about or the specific product or brand. I think that's an important piece of it. And most moderators, right, they are curious. That's why they get into the business, because they just want to learn more about how consumers make decisions or what drives their behaviors and things like that. So I think curiosity is a big piece of this. And then I do think that we sort of talked about some of the softer questions or the fit. Like I think a certain level of enthusiasm is also a really nice way to bridge any of the gaps between sort of category usage or being exactly what the participant is too. So sort of this idea of kind of like, I may not know about this, but I really want to know about it. Tell me more about it. I'm excited about it. I'm interested in hearing from you. I think it's as important as it is to be, if I'm talking to parents, a parent, because I think that just shows like an openness and a willingness to learn about it if you don't already know about it, which is really what a moderator is doing, right? It's like sort of digging deep into sort of the pieces that inform why someone makes a decision.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a process.
so
Yeah,
yeah,
I think that's 100% true. Um, all right, I think this is a great place for us to end. I think we did a
uh,
great job in our first podcast back, our first post-fire.
I know.
Yeah, baby.
I feel like we're a little rusty, but by the next one, we'll have it. We'll be a well-oiled machine.
Yeah, there's so many good jokes right there that I don't think I could say.
Please just let him go.
All right, well, thank you so much for talking about this. This was fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't wait for the next one.
All right, talk to you later.